again, in your book, you talk about presidential writing, and how in some ways it was overlooked historically in many biographies. What can we learn from presidential writing, and what is the importance of conveying ideas in writing?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple important lessons to learn, and what's interesting is that nobody had really pieced this together. There'd never been a book about presidents in the books they'd written before I wrote mine, and so kind of connecting those dots, I guess it makes sense why people overlook them, because if you look at most political books today, it's really easy to be cynical. Now, there are exceptions. Barack Obama is a great example. His presidential memoirs are obviously a book that he worked hard on, a very serious book, a book that historians will grapple with for a long time. But most political books, and frankly on both sides of the aisle, are just attempts to separate voters from their money, or to get those candidates on TV to talk about themselves. And so when the modern version of these books can be disappointing, it's easy to believe that every version of these books has been disappointing. I mean, frankly, that's kind of what I thought when I first started poking around this topic. But what I found, and why I think this is such an important topic and that so much can be learned, is that these books have actually been central to American history from the very beginning. I sort of talk about two traditions. I talk about campaign books, which are books that sort of help somebody get to the White House. And I talk about legacy books, which are books somebody writes after the White House. The first campaign book came from Thomas Jefferson, and the first legacy book came from John Adams, who, not many people know this, but he worked on a presidential memoir and wrote more than 400 pages before he gave up on it. So the history of presidents writing books is the history of America itself. We start with those two. And Washington actually had several requests to write an autobiography, and decided that he wasn't fit to do it. But this goes back as far as America itself. And these books have often been at the center of really important elections. And it baffles me that we don't understand this more today. And I think it's just because we let the current version of the books distort the historical truths of the books. So even if you're a big history fan, you will learn things in my book about important elections, like the election of 1860, or the election of 1920, or the election of 1960. The elections where one of the most important parts of the election was a book written by a president that was a massive bestseller, that conveyed ideas directly to voters, and that really helped a candidate get to the White House. Probably my favorite example in the book is Abraham Lincoln, because there's no one who's been written about more in the English language than Abraham Lincoln, I don't think. But there's even the best biographies of him don't really delve into the fact that he wrote and published a book, and that it's not a book that somebody else did for him. He worked obsessively behind the scenes to make sure every detail, every comma was exactly how he wanted it to be. This book came out right before he ran for president, and it was a runaway bestseller. If you adjust the sales totals by population, because America was a much smaller country back then, it's the equivalent of selling 500,000 copies today. And really, that number should feel even bigger, because books were very expensive in Lincoln's time, and books were more shared. So selling a copy in his time, it was very likely that that book was shared among a family or even a community. So this book was vital to him running for and winning the White House. Newspapers at the time talked about it constantly. Mr. Lincoln's book. At first, they called it Abram Lincoln's book, because he was so new on the national political scene that they couldn't get his name right. But because of his ideas, and because of the way they were conveyed in that book, they started getting his name right, and the book was essential to him winning the White House.
Also, do you see it at all concerning? Because a lot of these presidents also kept like personal journals and diaries and whatnot. I don't see that as a possibility these days with more contemporary politicians, because there's the risk of somebody stealing it, somebody leaking it, or somebody having to subpoena it in some situations, right? And are you concerned about the future of presidential writing?
I am. It's interesting that you mentioned that. One thing that I always wondered and expected to blow up, and I probably should have just written about this, but it never did, was that Obama talked in a couple early interviews when he started his White House term about keeping a journal to help him write a presidential memoir, which is something that lots of other people done. Lady Bird Johnson did it. Jimmy Carter did it. Bill Clinton did a version of it. And I thought, as soon as he said that, I was like, well, that's definitely going to get subpoenaed by Republicans in the White House or in Congress, and become part of a big political debate, as Reagan's diaries did during the Iran Contra scandal. But nobody ever really brought it up or went with it, which really surprised me. And I mentioned Obama's example just to say that, I'm not ready to go full narrative of decline here, because it's a little hard to say we'll never have literary presidents or something essential about writing has been lost when, not that many presidents ago, we had one of our most literary presidents ever. So, sometimes it's sort of there are so few presidents that trends are really dictated by individuals. And so if we have another individual like Obama in the next couple presidents, well, then you could actually make the argument that literature is still essential to the White House and to American public life. That may not happen though, but either way, because of the legal and political strategies that you talk about, and how anything committed to writing can become public, I definitely think there is less of a written record being produced than that there used to be. There are other examples of sort of pivot points like this in history, whether it's telephones, or also leading to less of a written record. So things will definitely change, and things will be different, and historians will have to adapt. But I remember when I was working on my book, getting to start working on the late 19th century, like post-Civil War, and working on, the chapters on Grant and the chapters on Roosevelt and Wilson, and just being like, man, there's just like, all of a sudden it's a problem of bounty. There's so many good details. There's so many good scenes, and I'm having to really choose what to include and what not, so I don't bog the book down too much. And I realized the reason for that was that we had their letters, we had autobiographies, which were now sort of like a widely accepted thing, being written by, Grant. 4 of the 5 main editors he worked with wrote their own autobiographies, including Mark Twain. So you could draw on all of that documentation. You could draw on the letters, you could draw on Grant's letters, you could draw on Grant's papers. So there were just so many sources. And that was just such a wonderful period to be able to write about historically. But even by, World War II, you start to see some of that stuff fading away. So there will definitely be changes. And I think it will be harder to work as a historian, but historians have to adapt, and we do have advantages. We have video now. It's, if you're wondering, you can find great pictures of Ulysses S. Grant, but you can't find any video of him. So as a historian, your job is to just sort of adapt and find new media, and still bring a literary eye and a literary intelligence to those media.
To that point, I thought about that too when I was listening to you answer the question, and something about writing is different than video, right? In video, sometimes it could look staged. People are trained to look a certain way, speak a certain way, take certain pauses. It's practice, especially with politicians and presidents. What I realized in your book, and if you read any presidential biography, really, is that most presidential, when they write, it's very personal, and they're very vulnerable, right? It's the one time they know nobody's gonna judge them for whatever they write, because it's between them and the journal. Right. And I think if we set a precedent where presidents can't keep journals or are afraid to keep journals, we're going to lose a big part of what future biographers are going to base their research on.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's never, you can't be someone that powerful without there being a little bit of artifice leaking in somewhere. Like even Jefferson and Adams, when they would write letters and when they would work on their autobiographies, they knew they would even, the way Jefferson organized and reorganized his papers as he got close to his death, he knew that Americans would pore over every single thing he had written and that he chose to save. And so that's in the back of their mind. But I still totally agree with you that the act of writing, it really just forces you to slow down. And what's cool about it is that it's a very democratic force. It's something we all identify with. Even if you're writing a Facebook post or a text message, translating what's in your head into text that someone else will then translate into something into their head causes everybody to slow down, causes everybody to think and reflect. It's a very human moment, and it's a very internal moment. Even if you're working with a ghostwriter and the ghostwriter asks questions and you have to review a manuscript, it's still causing you to slow down and be as precise as you can be about what you think, what you feel, what you're scared of, what you're trying to accomplish, what your goals are. And so there's something about writing that is, like you said, really intimate and really human. And that was one of my favorite things about working on this book, is that even presidents who, like a JFK, like a Lincoln, that are sort of statues at this point, it's very hard to humanize them or to see them as human beings. When you look at their writing, or when you look at the kind of behind the scenes stories about how their writing was produced, you can catch them in those human moments. And I think that's something that's really special about writing, and was one reason I was so excited to write a book about books.
Yeah, maybe starting from the